studio with us for this conversation is Deki Omukolba, who is an analyst, joining us to take a look at some of what's making headlines on the dailies this morning. Thank you for joining us, Deki.
Thank you.
All right, so we begin with a look at all the headlines on the daily. So on the front page of the Standard newspaper there, we have Raila arrest fears and David Ndii probed. And that is a story that is making headlines on all the dailies this morning. On the Daily Nation there, it says 50,000 new jobs lined up for teachers in matters education there. And on the Star newspaper, why top economist Ndii was arrested. So let's begin with us making headlines on the Standard newspaper this morning. Raila arrest fears and why David Ndii was probed. That is the front page of the dailies. And it was a long time, for David Ndii to be in police hands, and the DPP recalling his file, even as Raila Odinga now expresses the fear of police going for more of his allies to intimidate them. But what did you make of the entire David Ndii saga yesterday?
Yeah, I would say that Honorable Raila's fears are valid based on the fact that David Ndii was arrested in a way that is not the proper way of arresting a person. Right. There is always a charge sheet that is supposed to be given when somebody is to be arrested for a particular charge. Which was not the case when it comes to, David Ndii. The other thing which was a little bit surprising is that they, arrested him when he was in Diani for a family function, which would, you would assume that they would have arrested him while he was in Nairobi. Right. So, the things that surround his arrest are a little bit controversial, and that is why, Honorable Raila is coming out strongly to begin to say that maybe this is something that will be seen in other, allies to NASA.
All right. Many say this signals Kenya's descent into dictatorship, so to speak. Where is the place of freedom of speech where we stand now? Because David Ndii has been very vocal about the ills of the Kenyatta administration. Very recently, he wrote an article about secession, saying, Kenya's marriage is an abusive marriage. It is time we begin talking divorce. But on page 6 here, Raila says, or he claims it is a bid to kill dissent as Ndii is freed without charge. With the opposition being so hell-bent on their civil disobedience, where are we heading as a country?
It's very true that we have freedom of speech in this country, but of course on the other side we would imagine that when the government would begin to feel that there are people who are really pushing the envelope, that they would come out very strongly in opposition to this. So this is something that maybe we would expect when it comes to matters of dictatorship. We would assume that the government would take the right channel when it comes to dealing with some of these issues, and that is a narrative that needs to be put out there. We also have to remember the situation that we find ourselves as Kenyans. We are in a very volatile place, and even though we want to keep the stability of the nation, we have to do it right. And this is not a play that will only be done by the government. The opposition also needs to come in, because at the end of the day, it's for the sake of the people. This push and pull has to come to a place where people are able to dialogue and to be able to reach to a consensus.
All right. And of course, it remains unclear really why David Ndii was arrested from the authorities. The charge sheet read that he was being arrested for questioning for incitement to violence. But many also say that the statements, NASA says, the swearing in of Raila Odinga are just mere political statements. That these people, are big brains, serious brains, to know they cannot actually carry out this swearing in. But with that said, with President Uhuru Kenyatta already sworn in, does the manner in which David Ndii was arrested perhaps signal some tension, some sort of panic within State House itself?
Yeah, when things like this do happen, then you would imagine that there is a lot of tension that would go on in State House, because the government definitely wants to keep the stability, and they know that December 12th is coming, and that is something that is a very volatile situation, and we do not know yet which direction it will go. So the government would want to keep the stability of this nation at all costs, which is their job to some extent, but we are very hopeful that things will not turn violent.
All right. So we'll be taking a look at how that situation unfolds. We'll be discussing that later in a bit more detail as well on the political point this morning. But let's move on to page 9 of the paper. The cabinet secretaries to lose pension in a new 10-year work rule. So it says here that members of parliament plan to change pension laws to lock out civil servants who exit early. And cabinet secretaries whose terms are not renewed may not enjoy retirement benefits if the amendment to pension laws goes through in parliament. And this comes just as, the country tries to wrap its head around the ballooning wage bill. The president is in the process of reconstituting his cabinet here. There's been a lot of criticism with regard to the political rewards that we're seeing and the fact that there may be more cabinet slots or, more slots created just to fit these people in, increasing the wage bill. Is this a good idea for the country?
The fact that, it's very obvious that when people work, that there is an amount of time that is specified for you to be able to enjoy some benefits, which is something that we should be able to see that cuts across the board. The government or, the country is really suffering economically when it comes to some of these positions that are heavy, heavy to manage. And therefore, some of these things need to come in place where people don't just work for 1 year and go home with millions and millions of shillings. For the sake of this nation, there needs to be some things put in place, strategies as to how things will run with regards to some of these positions.
And I find it quite a good idea. I mean, 10 years means 2 terms for state officers, and that means you're either re-elected because you did something right, or you were reappointed because you worked, had a development record. So I think it is, a good idea to go. But let's delve on matters education now. That was on page 10 and 11 of the Standard newspaper. And all schools are sharing land to have 1 head teacher, orders Cabinet Secretary Fred Matiang'i. It is a move that has been termed as unworkable by unions or members of the various teachers' unions. But the Cabinet Secretary says it is a move set to reduce rows over boundaries and use of facilities and social amenities. But before we get to that, the question we're asking our viewers this morning is to share their views on the performance of Education CS Fred Matiang'i. Just yesterday, we had the Form 1 selection kick-off. We've never seen it kick off this early. What do you make of his performance?
Definitely, CS Matiang'i has been working very, very hard. And I think with an understanding of where the education was, the education department as a whole was, and him wanting to lift it from the place that it was to another level that he deems fit. And it's something that we have seen him do along the years, which is very commendable. I think that he has done a good job in pushing forward some agendas that are right.
All right, so that's on page 10 and 11 there. So on page 11, we see CS orders relief as selection begins. But let's focus on what's on page 10. Principals appeal for expansion of schools. So as it stands, the Ministry of Education is looking at about 100% transition rate from primary to secondary school. But there's been a lot of questions as to whether secondary schools are prepared for this intake of candidates to these schools. And principals are now appealing for expansion to these schools. I mean, does this signal preparation as a country for this new phase of free secondary education?
I think it's going to be a challenge because it's obvious that schools have capacity to which they could extend. It's not just about bringing in students and, bundling them up into a classroom. There are facilities that can only accommodate X number of students, and that is something that needs to be put in place so that we just don't bring in, the students and at the end of the day compromise on the quality of education. So their call for the expansion of schools is right, and I don't just think it's about expansion of schools per se as to create more space to bring in students, but it needs to be an expansion of everything, the expansion of, the bringing in of more teachers, more facilities to be able to accommodate the large number of students who will be coming into these various schools.
Yeah, it is something we're following up on, but even as the Form 1 selection kicks off, the issue of the free primary school education, but also the new education system, the 2633 system, a very digital one. So teachers need to be very digitally savvy, students need to be very digitally savvy. According to the government, this will be rolled out in January next year to all the 28,000 primary schools across the country. And it gives an indication or a perception that all these 28,000 schools then have enough facilities, all connected to the national electric grid to facilitate the new education system. Do we need to ask more questions there?
We definitely do. Of course, we cannot negate the fact that we need to, as a nation, move towards best practices when it comes to issues of education. But at the same time, we need to be considerate of the environment that we find ourselves in. I think this is something that can be done as a pilot program in some schools. And as it is successful, then it moves into other avenues. Of course, it is not impossible. We as a nation have been able to go digital, where you go into, the mashinani many areas, and you find people being able to transact business over the phone, etc., etc. So it's not something that is impossible, but it's something that has to be gradually integrated into the system.
Absolutely. And I understand that the pilot program has been going on for a few months now. What we do not have is a report on how well that pilot program worked. But let's move on to page 13 of the paper here. This is an interesting one. Drama as supporters trail Raila Odinga to the airport. Now, it was a security scare there. Hundreds of motorbike riders forced their way into the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. They're demanding to be addressed by NASA leader Raila Odinga. And he just wound up a meeting in Town Hall, and he was catching a flight back. Oh, no, this was not. This was at the Kisumu Airport, rather, catching a flight back to Nairobi. But what does it say about the very fact that, I mean, we know that Raila Odinga is an enigma in a way, especially for his supporters, but what does it say that he receives this kind of, what would I say, attention from his supporters wherever he goes in the wake of the political turmoil that we have today?
I think one thing that we need to consider is that in the milieu of all that has been going on, Honorable Raila Odinga has not had the opportunity to go to Kisumu when all these things were going. So it's obvious that his supporters would want to hear from him. He has been operating much in Nairobi area, and this was, you know, like a debut entry into Kisumu after the nullification of the elections and, you know, the other upholding of the elections. So it would be obvious that his supporters would want to hear from him, especially on the way forward, because, you know, they tend to really gravitate towards what he says with regards to, you know, how they should behave.
All right. And that being said, I mean, he's already said in public, you know, it's come from Raila Odinga himself that there will be a swearing in on the 12th of December, as much as political pundits say these are just political statements. But how will that impact his supporters if there indeed isn't a swearing in? Because I remember on Tuesday, when the president was being sworn in, there was expected to be a parallel swearing in. And when that did not happen, his supporters were not the happiest lot.
You know, we have to remember that Raila Odinga is also a politician at the end of the day. And politicians are meant, you know, they are known to give out statements and revoke them and, you know, kind of build up on them and say something else. So it would be interesting to see how he would navigate through this narrative, whether or not he will go ahead with the swearing in or he will, you know, give another statement where his supporters are concerned. They always say a day in politics is a long time. So between now and the 12th of December, we are bound to see maybe a change or not.
All right. And I mean, a lot can happen overnight. We could see a very different political scene even tomorrow.
Yeah.
Let's wind up on page 14 on the Standard. This is the daily cartoon here. And I have David D, who is detained here. He's seated, and the officers around him say orders from above not to let you free unless you join the cabinet. And these cartoons usually speak 1,000 words. What do you make of this illustration today?
The person who definitely did this cartoon has a, you know, a lot of imagination. But the truth of the matter is that anything can happen. It's true that, you know, anything did happen because we are not very clear of what happened, you know, in as far as arresting David D was concerned, why he was arrested, who gave the orders for him to be arrested. Definitely, you know, the government would want to silence him or would want him to change his narrative. That is something that is very, very, very possible. So in the days to come, maybe we would wait for him to speak and be able to inform everybody else what happened.
All right. And just in passing here, we do have the Financial Standard on the daily this morning, and on page 8 and 9 of that is two interesting articles with the rate cap law firmly in place, banks now called truce. It is something we'll be talking about later on at about 8:30 a.m. We'll have an economist in studio just to analyze the economic situation in the country. But on page 9, an interesting article for those of us who've been following up the news lately, Kenya's mafia-style bank heists of the 90s. So it wasn't just the KCB Thika bank heist that trended on social media, where they stole 50 million shillings. In 1997, the money was actually stolen from Standard Chartered Bank, 90 million shillings. So it is an interesting report on how that was done and the brains and sweat that went into getting that money. Do grab your copy of the Standard for that. Let's move on to the Daily Nation this morning, and on the front page there, 50,000 new jobs lined up for teachers. Again, back to the education sector. We've had teachers go on strike. We've had teachers complain that they need, you know, a reinforcement in their workforce as well. But initially, the Jubilee government had promised about 40,000 new teachers a year, if I'm not wrong. By the end of their 5-year term, they had employed those 40,000 teachers in total. They're now looking at 50,000 new jobs lined up for teachers. Do you think this is enough to sort of reduce the workload in the education sector?
It may not be enough per se, but it is a good start, bearing in mind that they want 100% transition from primary school into secondary school. So there is definitely a need to increase the workforce in as far as teachers is concerned. So that is a good start, and it needs to happen, especially if this vision of moving all the students into high school, you know, is accomplished. So that needs to happen. The need to reinforce the teacher force needs to be there.
All right, and I think a lot happening in the education sector. So we are having new teachers being hired in secondary schools. But other than free secondary education, the government is also going to distribute textbooks to schools directly from next year. And so this is really reducing what parents would have to spend, especially in taking a Form 1 child to school, usually a very expensive affair. Would you say this is one of the biggest milestones of the Jubilee administration, or shaping up to be one of them?
Definitely, you know, this coming in at this time is very, very positive. But I think also C.S. Matiang'i had mentioned that what surrounds the book sale is a lot of cartel that has been going into, and the fleecing of parents, and being able to put a heavy load on them. So when the government takes up some of these responsibilities in an attempt to assist, you know, the citizens, then it is a good thing. We know that parents do cater for a lot when it comes to taking a child to Form 1. It's a very expensive undertaking. So when the government comes in to assist, that is very, very commendable.
All right, and of course questions arising as to how free is this free secondary education? There are those who say we haven't quite got the free primary school education right just yet, and now we're moving these same students. You know, there was a report by Taweza East Africa just last week saying about a third of our students are not learning anything. Many of them cannot read and write, and they're moving now to secondary school for free secondary education. Do we need to sort of streamline our education sector in a way to ensure that it is not, because there's a lot of cramming, you know, in our education sector. I would attest to that. Do we need to make changes? Do we need to also better define what this free secondary education is, because parents with children in boarding schools still have to pay something?
It's very true. I think when reports like this come out, then it gives us an understanding of what is going on the grounds, and we need to go back and be able to fix things and be able to build up on what we already have. It's true that our education system needs a lot of, you know, going back and repairing and building up on the system so that we could be able to move forward and make it better. It's true that there are so many things that surround it. There are students that are not really learning because of the situation in some of the schools, which is something that needs to be addressed. Yet there are students on the other end who are getting a lot of positive, you know, support from the schools that they find themselves. So the ability to bring a level of equality among the schools is something that needs to be looked into.
All right. Let's take a look at page 7 before we take a look at some politics here. Align spending to Uhuru goals, says Treasury Cabinet Secretary Henry Rotich. And he has told ministries and departments now align their short-term and medium-term goals to suit President Uhuru Kenyatta's 4 priority areas. That is on page 7 of the Daily Nation, page 7. And this is even as President Uhuru Kenyatta reconstitutes his cabinet. What would you say are the most important dockets for him to leave a legacy?
Oh, definitely the economy would come at the top, you know, issues to do with healthcare. Some of the things that we saw a lot of challenges from his last term, the health sector, the education sector. Of course, when it comes to issues of agriculture, we faced a lot of challenges last time when it comes to issues of drought and even issues of water shortage. So those are some of the areas that we would expect him to put more emphasis. Of course, our continual strengthening of relationship with the international community. So that would be something that, you know, you would want to see come into place. The areas of tourism, I think you would kind of mention all of them.
I mean, he needs to focus on everything.
on all of them, yes.
All right.
Yeah.
So we'll be taking a look at that. We're still not sure whether he will be naming the cabinet nominees today, whether it will be later in the week, but we're keeping an eye on that. So on page 8 of the paper is an interesting and rather heartbreaking story, actually. Mother of baby stuck with needles arrested. So this is A mother of an 8-month-old baby, or 10-month-old baby actually, who was admitted at Thika Level 5 Hospital last month with 14 needles in her body. And the mother there was arrested. Both parents were arrested, but the mother says she's not the one who did it. The father says he's not the one who did it. And the mother says she spends all her time with her child. So a lot of questions arising as to who did it. But we saw child, protective services come in and take the child. But a lot of issues of child abuse and child neglect, are on the rise in the Kenyan society lately. What do you think this points to?
It's definitely a mysterious thing, when you look at it, that the child has been able to survive with all those needles,
the pain
and discomfort that goes in. Of course, the mother needs to be asked questions when it comes to this issue. We definitely do sympathize with her, but we need to, the government or those who are in charge with childcare need to be able to put emphasis where children are not neglected or abused. So that is something that needs to be ruled out, beginning with as they move forward in being able to help this particular child. So answers need to be found with regards to this baby.
All right, and that's a very, very heartbreaking story there. All right, so let's go to page 11 just before we wind up with the nation there. Gender parity is still a mirage in listed firms' boardrooms, and the issue of gender parity, both in the public sector and the private sector, has been one of debate for a long time now. But, it seems even in the private sector, even in the corporate sector, gender parity is still a mirage. I mean, how do we begin sorting this gender dilemma, because it's all over in the public political scene, in the private scene as well?
I think the fact that we continually push this narrative is a positive thing, so that we insist on the issue of gender balance, bringing in more women when it comes to some of these positions. We are definitely not at zero, but we need to keep on with it, we keep on with the momentum, so that we keep on ensuring that when it comes to some of these positions and some of these sittings, that there is a representation of women, in parliament, in boardrooms, and in other sectors. So it is a positive narrative that we have, and I think we need to continue pushing it forward.
All right.
Yes.
Finally, page 14 of The Nation, the daily cartoon there, and this looks like Uhuru Kenyatta with his cabinet nominees. Again, an interesting one, if we can have that up on the screen on page 14 of The Nation. So President Uhuru Kenyatta is, thinking hard, over who's going to be in his new cabinet. And behind him is the Resist Brigade saying rotten eggs this time. So it looks like President Uhuru Kenyatta only has rotten eggs to choose from to put in his basket for the new cabinet. It says a lot about the manner the appointments are made. Do you think that President Uhuru Kenyatta is going to be a little more careful with his cabinet this time, considering it is his final term?
Definitely he should be. We would expect that he is, that he's going to be. There are many things that come into play when it comes to choosing, members of the cabinet. And, issues to do with performance, issues to do with regional balance, the bringing in of politicians, which is something that never seems to go away. So those are some of the things that we will see in play, even the issues of gender, gender balance coming into play in those. So the president definitely has so many things, so many ingredients to use when it comes to this cooking process.
Right.
So we hope that he's going to put the right measures for each and every ingredient.
Let's hope so.
Yes.
So let's wind up with a cartoon on page 3 of the Star newspaper this morning as well. And it's an interesting one again. Jubilee making freedom of expression very expensive. This, of course, I'm sure is related to the arrest of David D and previous other arrests of thin bloggers being arrested as well. But again, where does this leave the place of freedom of expression, a constitutional right?
Definitely freedom of expression is our right, is a constitutional right, and we're supposed to enjoy it. But at the end of the day also, we have to be very careful or sensitive of the environment that we do find ourselves in, even when we utter speeches as citizens and even as leaders in this nation, because we know that there have been instances where leaders have uttered speeches that have sparked violence, and that is something that needs to be put in check and in place so that we do not abuse the freedoms that we have. Because if we do abuse the freedoms that we have, then we will begin to see a push from those who are charged with the responsibility of making sure that things are in place. So it's true that we would encourage the government and everybody around us that these are freedoms that needs to be respected, but those of us who have the benefit of these freedoms should be able also to work and play within the boundaries of them.
All right, many thanks, Dickie. So that's what's making headlines on the dailies this morning. You do grab your copies of these papers for for those and more stories. Deki Omukoba was our analyst in studio for our press review this morning. It is now 6 minutes to the top of the hour. We'll take a short break here on Morning Express. When we come back, it is time for the political point.